The U.S. Senate has unanimously approved a bill to impose sanctions on business and individuals that undermine Hong Kong's autonomy or erode freedom of Hong Kong residents. The measure comes as tensions over Hong Kong have now increased over the past year, with China cracking down on protesters. At a time when it has a host of troublesome issues with Beijing, the move is a bipartisan rebuke of China, which also targets police units that have cracked down on Hong Kong protesters. And Chinese Communist Party officials responsible for imposing a strict national security law on Hong Kong are at the target of the bill. China has been seeking to exert more control over the former British territory.
What the government of China is doing in Hong Kong is unacceptable. They are taking away the rights of the people in Hong Kong. They are snuffing out the freedoms that exist there right now.
The measure also includes secondary sanctions on banks that do business with anyone found to be backing any crackdown on Hong Kong's autonomy.
Beijing must know that its actions have consequences. This resolution today makes clear that that will be the case, and that is why so many in Hong Kong are so eager to see it pass, and why Beijing is so hopeful that it will fail. As I said a week ago, the struggle of the free people of Hong Kong is the struggle of all free people everywhere.
U.S.-China relations have worsened since the coronavirus pandemic. China's security legislation prompted Trump to initiate a process to eliminate special economic treatment that has allowed Hong Kong to remain a global financial center. President Donald Trump's administration has already declared that it no longer considers Hong Kong's autonomous under U.S. law. The House of Representatives still needs to pass the bill, though. Let's quickly get in some perspective about the latest developments that have taken place. For more on this, I'm joined in by Richard Kimber, who's joining me live from Hong Kong this hour. A very warm welcome to you, Richard. Now, let me begin by asking you, how do you view the two bills passed by the U.S. Senate, especially when one of the bills condemns China for violating a 1984 agreement that guarantees autonomy for Hong Kong? Is the United States now holding China accountable for the treaty obligations under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which, of course, China was trying to escape?
Well, certainly, as you could hear from those sound bites from the various press conferences that were given after this bill was passed, the rhetoric from the US is very strong on this issue. And this bill, in fact, was passed in the Senate remarkably quickly, just over a month since it was first introduced. So there's a clear effort on the part of the US to keep upping the pressure on China, while simultaneously there's a clear effort on the part of China to push this bill through as quickly as possible, this national security legislation. They, in Beijing, will be meeting from Sunday onwards, and it's highly expected that this law will be introduced into Hong Kong formally and officially by Tuesday, which would be the end of June 30th. So basically what's interesting now is the US is pushing through this new piece of legislation as quickly as it can. As I say, it's a very fast process through the Senate, while simultaneously in Beijing from Sunday onwards, the NPC there will be sitting down to probably formally approve this national security law such that it will be completely imposed on Hong Kong before the 1st of July, which is the handover anniversary day. So if it's purely a case of legislative races, China will probably win this one, because the US Senate still has to push this bill through the US House of Representatives, and then it still has to be signed and approved into law by President Trump. So by the time that happens, it's highly likely that the national security law will have already been introduced in Hong Kong.
Right. That's a very valid point that you've stated. And talking about how U.S. wants to counter China, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has already stated that the U.S. is reviewing force deployment to counter China's threat to India and Southeast Asia, and that a partnership with EU is needed to tackle the China challenge. What do you make of the change in America's strategic resource allocation and the change in force posturing from Russia to now China?
Well, yes, separately to this push through the Senate, Mike Pompeo has been teaming up with the EU during a a conference event there to try and increase the pressure on China, to try and do, as in his words, to try and up the ante on the challenge of China's ascendancy. Now, this kind of bilateral agreement between the US and the EU on this is clearly adding to the pressure on China, but ultimately, again, it doesn't seem to be causing any delay or any hesitation on the part of China with regards to this security law. It's also been said in the US Senate that some senators have been hesitant about whether or not even this new Senate bill will make any difference. And there's certainly been no indication here that China is particularly paying any attention to either the US-EU partnership on this issue or the new US Senate bill. The state media here still running editorial lines talking about how important it is for the EU to continue to develop its trade ties with China, similarly talking about how important it is for other countries, including Australia, to develop their ties with China. The state media very strongly saying how important China is to the rest of the world, and that any number of international critiques of China's political behaviour will not make any difference.
So clearly it seems like the security law is now all set to take shape in the coming week. Richard, last but not the least, organisers of Wednesday, July 1st handover pro-democracy march are all set to protest despite no police approval yet. How crucial is it for the protests to remain non-violent? Isn't there a greater risk of arrests now by the Chinese forces, which indirectly could also risk Hong Kong's forcible occupation by China?
Well, I spoke to one of the protest event organisers yesterday, and he was explaining that they've put in an application to the police to try and find a way to hold this event despite the coronavirus restrictions that are still in place. Police say those restrictions mean that it's impossible to allow a large gathering like a protest march to take place, and it doesn't seem at the moment as though police are going to give any kind of approval for this. Despite that, as you say, the protest organisers trying to encourage people to gather, but they're adamant that they want this to be a non-violent, peaceful march. The question really is how many of the more radical protesters who ended up taking part in much more violent clashes with police last year and vandalising lots of public property and so on, how many of them still feel emboldened to do that when the pressure this time is not just from the Hong Kong government with regards to controversial pieces of legislation, but now very clearly the pressure coming directly from Beijing. And there is a certain amount of trepidation now among the protest organisers that they're not sure how things will develop if there are scenes like we saw last year, bearing in mind the introduction of this new security law. So Wednesday will be a big testing point to see how the police in Hong Kong can deal with some kind of mass protest march if it has not been given approval.
Very rightly said. It is going to be a testing point to see how China also reacts to these pro-democracy protesters. We'll keep coming back to you for more, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us here on this broadcast.